With the advent of such bikes as the Lapierre Ease SD, the Orbea Rise, or recently the Forestal, it does give riders the conundrum: are you a lightweight, low-power e-mountain biker, or maybe a heavier weight, and only slightly heavier weight, high-power rider? Well, today we have got a selection of turbo bikes from Specialized, because they are, after all, one of our partners, to help you guys answer some of the questions when making the decision on what type of rider you are. Because after all, how the hell do you make sense out of all this? Well folks, I'm sure you'll agree this is some party we've got going on here today, but the question is, which one is the wallflower, which one is the extrovert, which is the bar propper, and who is the joker in the pack? But the bigger question is, which one brings some fizz, and who brings the weak old Fosters? Right, let's begin with a brief overview of the four bikes, looking at travel, motor, wheels and weight. Beginning with the Kinivo, we've got 180 front and rear, the Levo 160, 150, 170, 170 on the Kenevo SL, and 150, 150 on the Levo SL. Now switching now to the motors. Now these two bikes, the Levo and the Kinivo SLs, have got the 35 Nm motor in there with a 320 internal battery. Of course, you've got the bolt-on additional battery which you can get on there as well. And the Levo and the Kinivo have both got 90 Nm motors with 700 watt-hour batteries. What about the wheel size then, folks? Well, it's 27.5 front and back on the Kinivo. It's got a mix on the Levo, 29, 27.5, 29 front and rear on the Kinivo SL, and likewise on the Levo SL. But what about the weights? Okay folks, let's go for a weigh-in. Now, I'm going to weigh all bikes with pedals on, because I like to think that most of us ride bikes with pedals. Now, first of all is the SL. Okay, so we're looking at about 19.05. Now, bear in mind that this bike has got alloy wheels, and it's got a downhill tyre on the front and a downhill tyre on the back. Well, it's actually a 3C, but again, you know, it's 150mm travel, so it's a bike which is built for a bit of action, so pointless putting skinny tyres on the bike. So there you go, 19.01. But I would think that given the different wheels and tyres, it probably is a bike that will go down to about 18 kilos with different components. Okay, next up is the Kenevo SL. Now, we measured this at 19.6 yesterday, Nick, didn't we? Obviously, it's gathered a little bit of mud, so I'd take a few hundred grams off this figure. Actually, do you know what? That's crazy. It's actually got 19.45 today. So maybe it's the air pressure, Nick. What do you think about that, eh? So, compared to the Levo SL, this bike has actually got carbon wheels on it, and it is totally as stock. But it is an S-Works. So there you go, the S-Works Levo. Now, again, I've put a downhill tyre on the front of that bike and an alloy wheel, and it weighs in at 22.95 kilos. With the stock carbon wheel on it, it weighs in at 22.6 kilos. So there's a 300 gram saving there, plus of course the tyre as well. And finally, the all alloy, all action Kenevo, 27.5 wheels. Let's get on the scales. I've even put a little mud guard in there because I didn't want it to be felt left out. Oh, 23.90. 23.95 to 24. Wow. So there's a kilo difference between the Kenevo and the S-Works Levo. That's an expensive kilo, because this bike is around about £6,000 and the Levo is £13,000. Anyway, let me just digest that for a minute. But guys, let's just put that in perspective. You will notice that I've put a single crown fork on there. It is 180mm travel, and you can get this bike with a single crown fork option, plus an air shock. So if you want to see the video which I did which converts the Kenevo to a kind of Ken Duo, then check it out. But still, I think, you know, 23 kilos is pretty light. However, what can one do that the other cannot? In other words, what is the purpose of each of these bikes? Well, comparing these eMTBs is not as straightforward as comparing 150mm bikes with 170mm ones. There is an added layer of complexity in the motors and what they allow these bikes to do. So let's begin with climbing and have a look at the difference in the amount of power the lighter weight bikes have to the heavier weights and how much the rider puts in. Now, we've actually just shut this piece of track to illustrate the difference between the SL bikes and the full powered bikes. So this is a Supertech uphill, sorry, a Supertech downhill, but going uphill. Now this is on the KSL, same bit of track. Now it's not that the KSL can't do it, it's just a little tougher. And definitely more power from you. Now the really cool thing about the Kenevo SL and the Levo is the fact that it's got the Mastermind head unit, which gives you no end of metrics. And two really important ones are the rider power and the motor power. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to run the 35 Nm KSL up the hill, and then after that go up there on the Levo to compare the rider power, that's the wattage, and also the motor power in watts as well. Okay, so I'm going to be in turbo mode, and as you can see on the display here, I've got rider power, which is on the top, and motor power on the bottom. So I'm going to give it a quick, short, sharp blast, straight up. Now I'm already into 600 watts my power, as you can see there, about 270 motor watts. So 500 watts from me, 260 from the motor, 440. So I'm now settling into the climb, going down to about 300 watts and about 270 from the motor. Okay, so we are now on the Levo. Remember, this bike has got 90 Nm of torque compared to the 35 on the KSL. So turbo mode, and away we go. So this time, a lot lower. I'm knocking out about, oh crikey, actually I'm on 400 and 700. Look at that there, 700 from the motor. It's a lot more. It's also a lot quicker as well. I'm down now, settling in, 240 from me, 720 from the motor. As you can see then, they're very different in power outputs, but more importantly, where you can go on each is actually very different. These are essentially two very different breeds of eMTB. Maybe a lighter rider or more skilled person could do this super technical riding you see here, but then again, you might have no interest in this type of riding. It's about your presets, but just bear in mind your presets might actually change. And yet, whilst the biggest difference between SL bikes and higher power bikes is their weight and their ability to climb tech trails, essentially the Levo SL and the Kenevo SL are very close in their climbing ability. Compare that to the Levo and Kenevo, and it's surprising that the Kinivo too can climb anything the Levo can, thanks to his steep seat tube angle. Oh, and even hit some trials, as I did last winter. So are we simply talking fine tunes on two different classes? Well, the bikes do have some broader traits which we need to cover. So, as you can see, there is a significant amount of difference in terms of the effort you, the rider, put in on the Levo and the Kenevo SL compared to the Levo and the Kenevo. But going back to what I mentioned earlier about each of these bikes being different, they are different by design. But what about the nature of each of them? Now, the Levo SL is a light and nimble bike. It's very much a trail bike, 29-inch wheels. It's made for charging those downhills. Less so for technical, super technical uphill section. That's where the Levo and the Kenevo excel. But nevertheless, it's like I said, it's lively, it's light, it's lightning across the ground. And remember, it can go to places which you'd never dreamt about on a standard mountain bike. And the Levo, 29-inch wheel up front, 27.5 in the rear, 160 front, 150 rear. Now, the latest bike, the latest Levo in silhouette form is actually quite like the Kenevo. It's a bike that can do super technical trials. It is fearless at downhill. It is very much that trail enduro bike, but don't have any doubt about it, it can really rip those downhills too. And one final thing, on both the Kenevo SL and the recently launched Levo, it does have that mastermind display on the top tube, which gives you an unprecedented level of information on you, your bike and your ride. It really is next level. And the dear old KSL, the Kenevo SL, which was launched earlier this week, which, as Specialized point out, is a bike which puts the E into enduro because, after all, it is based on the similar geometry and, of course, the silhouette from the mountain bike version, the enduro. But boy, what a bike. It is actually a riot when it comes to downhill riding. 29-inch wheels front and rear, a really open cockpit. You really can move around on this bike. But the point is, you really do need some serious terrain to get the most out of this bike. There's no doubt about that. It's almost a downhill bike. And finally, the 180mm Kenevo, a bike which Specialized say is untamed and capable, a brawler by design. Personally, I just love beating the living daylights out of it because, after all, it is a bike that really loves nasty terrain and bike park bashing. But nevertheless, the downhill element of a bike's capability is very interesting. And if you think about it, there is, after all, only 30mm difference between the shortest travel Levo and the longest travel Kenevo. So let's have a look how they stack up on the downhills. Now, this is a classic bit of terrain here, which will show the strengths and weaknesses of all four bikes. It will also illustrate the different feeling, the different feedback from which you get from all the bikes. Now, obviously, the 180mm Kenevo will absolutely steamroller these routes. And that's for many reasons. It's the travel and also the full alloy chassis, alloy wheels, alloy handlebars, which, as you've seen from World Cup riders like Loic Bruni, they ride alloy simply because it's a little bit of a softer ride. Moving on to the Kenevo SL, now 170mm travel. The cool bit about the Kenevo SL is it's got a long front center. So, you know, we talk about things such as short chainstays for diving into corners. We talk about reach for fit, but that front center, which is from the bottom bracket to the front axle, on the Kenevo SL, it's a little bit longer than all the other bikes, so that gives you stability. So when the bike is compressing in these routes, it's going to give you a more stable ride and enable you to maintain your speed. Now, moving on to the Levo, slightly shorter travel, slightly stiffer chassis on the Levo, together with a bit of a more progressive suspension design. That's not going to be quite as comfortable as the Kenevo or the KSL in this terrain. And then finally, the Levo SL, the lightest bike, 29-inch wheels, a little bit more give in that chassis because, after all, it is a trail bike, not a downhill bike. But nevertheless, the compliance, the movement in the chassis and the wheels might actually enable you to move through this terrain pretty quickly. So how do the bikes feel? Well, I want to give you guys some insight into this, so time to hit the downhills to discuss what actually makes them different in that department. The mixed wheel size and the weight make the Levo closer to the Kenevo than the old Levo, but has the advantage of adjustability and a mastermind display, which the Kenevo does not. Compared to the Levo, the Kenevo has a firmer ride, and this is partly due to the suspension design, the frame layup and the wheels. It also has a more upright riding position, making it more trail than gravity. It's a slightly stiffer feel to the older Levo. When looking at the Kenevo, you have to bear in mind the shock, the fork, the smaller wheels, the weight. It's an alloy bike. It has the most travel. It's a bruiser. You have to bear in mind too that the Kenevo is available in both single crown or triple clamp versions. But in this trim, let's face it, it's just a longer travel Levo, right? Well, actually, it's longer all round and roomier. The S4 Kenevo is different in size to an S4 Levo. Longer reach, wheelbase, front center. It's lower and it's slacker, and the feeling from the alloy frame and slightly longer travel is more compliant. Some would say softer. Definitely a more forgiving ride out of the alloy frame. And through those routes, that definitely felt the quickest and smoothest. I got a nice amount of space to move around on the bike. The grip feels good. The Kinivo SL, it too is a bruiser. However, the feeling here is very different. There's a softer feel to the ride of this bike to the Levo. The suspension more linear, more supple, but you have to remember it has more travel on the rear. What characterises this bike is the room up front, the long front end. It's lighter weight with bigger wheels. It feels less nervy than both the Levo or the Levo SL and is easier to move around than the Kinivo. So a little bit more travel, front and rear. However, quite different geometry on this bike compared to the Levo. This is definitely a little bit more compliant than the Levo. There's probably a mix of suspension, larger wheels, and also the layup of the frame. The fork, the materials, the weight, the design, the 29-inch wheels, the shock tune all make this very much a trail bike. And have no doubt, this bike can drop off hills and mountains very fast. The skinnier Fox 34 fork, which many journos felt needed changing to a burlier one, doesn't hold this bike back whatsoever. Okay, so far the Levo's offered up the furthest ride. I would say the KSL the most compliant. This definitely feels more like a trail bike than the others. You'll see from the times then that there's not really much in it between these bikes downhill. So what actually matters? Is it wheel size? Does wheel size matter? Well, not really, although shorter riders might want to check out they can ride the bigger wheels on steeper terrain. It's a style thing more than anything. Is it weight? Well, weight does matter for sure, but let's not get too obsessed here. I'm sure we'd all trade a few grams for a few more miles of durability. What about the motor and the battery? Absolutely, the bottom line here is that the 35 Nm SL bikes simply cannot tackle the big nasty climbs the full power bikes can. It's really important to understand that the SL range are different bikes for different riding needs. And what about travel? Well, does that matter? Well, yes and no. You'll see the difference between the bike with the shortest travel and the longest is only 30mm. The bigger difference is actually in the shape of the bikes and how that geometry allows you to enjoy more of what you love doing best, be that trail, enduro or gravity riding. So 3 minutes, which puts you on the same time as the Levo SL. 3 seconds off the Kinivo SL. And what I didn't mention was the fact that we were in turbo mode on all the bikes. And remember, we're going to be above 25k for most of that run. But on a previous run where we had the Kinivo versus the Levo SL, the Levo SL was 8 seconds faster. And I think one of the reasons behind that is the fact of the shape of the track. So the key part of the story is that different tracks require different characteristics out of the bikes. This track, there was less sort of tight corners, so it was all about maintaining speed, maintaining flow down to the trail. Big holes, big roots, and all bikes were pretty close in that respect. So when you're talking about the feeling of all these bikes, I don't think it's the wheel size or the motor or the battery when you're going downhill. I think it's things such as the sort of stiffness and flex of the frame, which you feel more than anything, the sort of the suspension design, whether it's a bit more linear, a bit more progressive, and also that geometry. The Kinivo, definitely one of the longest, slackest bikes, so you've actually got to be pretty careful on how you ride that bike, especially with that low bottom bracket. But yeah, I mean, 6 seconds between all the bikes. It could be closer, just need to go and do a few more runs, and like I said, on a different track on a different day might yield different results, but bottom line, amazing fun. Yes, so there you go, folks. Quite a lot of information there to digest. But I think the message is that a lot of that detail is transferable to all e-mountain bikes, not just the turbo range from Specialized. Please, love to get involved in any questions or comments on the subject of what e-mountain bike to choose. It is incredibly difficult to choose a bike, whether it be on travel or motor or battery. But I think one thing that I've learned from riding the bikes in a short space of time is the whole business of agility. Now, some people say that the lower powered bikes are more agile than the higher powered ones, but What I will say is remember that e-mountain bikes is a two-way thing. There's the uphill as well as the downhill. So you could argue that the higher powered bikes are actually more agile in uphill situations. If you want to back that up, just have a look at the likes of Ken Roxon or Tony Bow to see just what agility and capability is on two wheels. So like I said, folks, please get involved in the comments. I'd love to get involved in the discussion about this whole subject. And yeah, well, look forward to seeing you down in the comments. Cheers.